Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Equitable Admissions webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we get started, I'd just like to let everybody know that today's meeting will be recorded and available after today's webinar for sharing on social media. I also want to let everyone know that after our panel discussion today, we will have an opportunity to answer any questions you might have. So as the webinar goes along, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat function or into the Q&A box rather, and we'll take those as they come through. It's now my pleasure to introduce the president of the Campaign for College Opportunity, Michelle Siqueiros. Michelle.
Thank you, Audrey. And thank you all for joining us today for this second webinar in our Affirming Equity, Ensuring Inclusion, Empowering Action National Initiative that we launched earlier this year in response to the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling to curtail the use of race in college and university admissions. I hope you were all able to join us for our first webinar covering the legal implications, what the decision meant, what it did not mean a few weeks ago. But if not, my team is sharing a link to the recording here in this chat so you can watch that critical conversation with Art Coleman and Thomas Saenz. Unfortunately, many of you as college and university leaders have questions as to how you can work to advance racial equity on your campuses, given this erroneous and grave decision by the Supreme Court. As you all know, race-conscious admissions was the most powerful tool to address the lack of diversity on college campuses and the centuries-long and ongoing legacy of racism and bias and exclusion in higher education. Affirmative action and the use of race-conscious admissions in colleges, it helps really provide more meaningful opportunity for Latino, Black, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander and American Indian Alaska Native students to be able to achieve their college dreams, contribute to a more diverse and vibrant workforce, and build a multicultural democracy. Despite the U.S. Supreme Court's decision, these still remain core values of our nation, and America's future truly depends on our ability to uphold the promise of college opportunity to all students, especially students who've been historically excluded and underserved by higher education. Returning to an era of exclusion or segregation in higher education is certainly not an option, especially when more than 50% of our K-12 public students today in this nation are students of color. That's why I'm really proud to be joined by scholars and experts today to share some of the tools, to share some guidance, and particularly to discuss how we can remove some of the discriminatory practices in college admissions and how we can put better practices in place. This includes, of course, rethinking recruitment practices for those of you doing college outreach and recruitment, ending legacy and early admission practices, and ending the use of tests in college admissions review. And most of all, employing a real comprehensive, holistic review when evaluating student applications. But first, to remind us why this work of ensuring equal opportunity for Latinx, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, American Indian, Alaska Native Americans is essential today more than ever. I'm really pleased to be joined by Lisa Holder. She's the president of the Equal Justice Society, a member of California's Reparations Task Force. Lisa holds a critical perspective on how equal opportunity to college is a racial equity, civil rights, and reparations imperative. Thank you for joining us, Lisa. I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you all at the Campaign for College Opportunity for this opportunity for such a critical discussion at this moment of inflection on race and inequality in education. I'm going to just talk to you about, I'm going to just make some general comments about approaches, about our overarching paradigm that we should be looking at in this post-affirmative action era. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about specific structural changes that we should be looking to institute. And finally, I'm going to be talking to you about some strategic movements that we should be making in this moment. Just generally, we have been handed this sort of race-neutral paradigm by the court. They're saying we are colorblind. Only approaches you can use are race-neutral approaches. You're stuck with it. Deal with it. All right, so let's deal with it. We need very innovative approaches to race-neutral. We need to think about race-neutral approaches in a transformational way. We need to be fearless in terms of the race-neutral approaches that we take. And those approaches need to be innovative. And I'm going to talk to you about removal of the SAT and the ACT from your review process as one race-neutral change that can be made, that can have a deep impact in terms of creating diversity, equity, and belonging on your campuses. But you know what? We also need to stand up and fight and recognize that just in the same way that you cannot treat cancer by being cancer blind, you cannot treat centuries of racism by being race blind and colorblind. And so there are moments when we need to be unapologetically race conscious. We need to be completely anti-racism oriented, despite the so-called pushback on wokeness. And we can do this. We can continue to be race conscious and anti-racist focused by making sure that our approaches are evidence-based. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about evidence-based approaches and try not to get too wonky. I am a civil rights attorney and a litigator of 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But I'm going to try not to get too wonky when I talk about ways that we can continue to be race conscious and unapologetically so in our strategies. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about the SAT and removing that structural barrier. I was one of the attorneys in the litigation against the UC system back in 2020, where we brought litigation to compel all UC campuses to go test free and stop using the SAT and the ACT. And we were very successful in our arguments to the court to eliminate that test, because all of the social science for 25 years showed that the test was merely a gatekeeper for the status quo, that it was discrimination based on wealth, race, and disability. And most importantly, the test did not test for college readiness. So it did not do what it purported to do. And so it literally just existed as a gatekeeper to make sure that disabled BIPOC students could not get access to our flagship UC system. And we were very successful in that argument. We were able to get an injunction from the court that required the UC to go test blind, test free, and eventually the entire California state school system went test free in a very sort of, strategic move that we anticipated would happen. And we need to have the removal of the SAT at all levels of higher education. When I say SAT, whether it's a GRE or the LSAT, whatever the equivalent is, we need to start removing these tests that really just exist as structural barriers and do not test someone's preparedness and readiness. we are happy to work with other states at the Equal Justice Society, people from other states who are looking to have a state school system that is test-free. The other thing that I have been working on, and it's been very near to my heart, is reparations. And reparations is another tool. It's a very strong tool that we can use to use structural barriers in education. Now, the reparations that I have been working on in California is specifically Black reparations. And it has been a 2-year task force. It's been a historical task force that I have been a part of. I was appointed by Governor Newsom to be on the California State Reparations Task Force. It's the first reparations task force that is statewide in the nation. And it was a 2-year process of hearings and collecting educational scholarship and essentially doing a massive disparity study to show that being Black is still the primary social determinant of your success in this country. It is consistently seen as a barrier to your educational status, to your wealth, etc. And we curated scholarship from over the last 20 years and spoke to hundreds of experts on discrimination and scores of Black Californians who have experienced discrimination in every walk of life, including in education, to collect information to essentially show that there's a debt owed, there's continuing ongoing discrimination that must cease and desist against African Americans. And one of the things that we have done is we have given recommendations to the legislature that go well beyond a paycheck. Financial compensation is about 1% of what we've recommended. We gave 115 recommendations to the legislature about repairing the harm to Black people. And most of those recommendations talk about changing our education system, creating equity in our education system, etc. And so one of the things that we should think about is using programs and paradigms like reparations that really focus on the most marginalized people in our systems, including in our K through 12 and higher education system, and making sure that the harm is repaired, that the debt owed to those folks is being paid, and that the systems going forward are equitable for the most marginalized people of color. The other thing that I want to talk about in terms of removing structural barriers to opportunity is creating pre-K through 12 opportunities. And right now we are focused on higher education, but we must understand that this is a holistic system, a holistic process, and we should be thinking about cradle to career opportunity and how education from the cradle to career is the great equalizer, and making sure it remains so. And so one of the things that we focus on at EJS is creating K through 12 opportunities. First of all, we focus on removing the barriers that exist, like dismantling the school to prison pipeline and Black and brown student pushout. We focus on creating pipelines so that you have more people of color teaching and in faculty positions, because the studies show that, for instance, if a student, a Black or brown student, has a teacher that looks like them by the time they are in 5th grade, they're 40% more likely to go to college. So we should really be thinking about pre-K through 12. And we should now, especially now that they have removed one of the critical tools for creating diversity, we should really be focused on Head Start and starting to level the playing field very early on. We know as educators what pre-K education can do in terms of a lifetime of achievement. We have to focus on pre-K. And we, those of us who are lawyers, those of us who are activists, should be moving to make sure that pre-K is a fundamental right. This is about creating a pipeline for marginalized students starting at pre-K so that they can, they have the uplift that they need to make it to college.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, because you're highlighting two important parts, right? How do we remove the barriers that exist in higher ed? And how do we also do the urgent work of ensuring that K-12 and Head Start equity is truly attainable for all students in our nation, right? Regardless of race, ethnicity, and zip code. So it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Art Coleman. Art Coleman is the managing partner and co-founder of Education Council. He's been an immense advocate, expert on education. He's championed access in college, diversity, inclusion, and much more. He really offers a lot of policy guidance. He's long advocated for race-conscious admissions, authoring amicus briefs in all of the previous cases before the Supreme Court, including Grutter versus Bollinger, Gratz versus Bollinger, and in Fisher versus University of Texas at Austin. Art, thank you for joining us again today.
Michelle, it's nice to be with you. I'll be brief. What I want to do is actually lift up from the court opinion. I'm not going to go through all of the details of the hundreds of pages of court opinion, but I want to lift up what I think are actually the affirming points out of the Chief Justice's majority opinion, and a couple of contextual points to keep in mind as we think through the avenues and options for enhancing diversity, access, and inclusion on our campuses around the country. So just to start with what the Chief Justice on behalf of 6 justices in the majority said, one, and importantly at this political moment in our nation's history, universities may define their mission as they see fit, period. It's an important statement to lift up, to recognize that this court, notwithstanding the fact that it challenged and ultimately ruled against the asserted compelling interests of Harvard and UNC, didn't indict or threaten the integrity of those interests standing alone to advance mission-driven goals. And that point, I think, is an important one in our current context. Correspondingly, in the same breath that the court actually struck down what it deemed to be, both for Harvard and UNC, racial classifications in their admissions process, a question I would challenge factually, but the ruling is what the ruling is. Even as it was basically saying that you can't consider an applicant's racial status in awarding benefits such as those associated with admissions decisions, the court said this: nothing in this opinion should be construed as prohibiting universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected their life. The touchstone of an individual's identity should be with respect to challenges bested, skills built, and lessons learned, not the color of their skin. So what the court has done in essence is lift up this dichotomy between now the prohibition against the consideration of an applicant's racial status versus the permissive consideration of qualities that an applicant may bring to the table that may be aligned with and associated with an institution's mission, and that may expressly tie to their racial experience and background and perspective. That we have an open door. And so, notwithstanding Lisa's earlier good point that we really are in a sort of race neutral world post a decision that embraced, at least rhetorically, this notion of color blindness, the actual practical impact here is something a bit more nuanced. And even though that I think the characterization of what the court did in embracing racial experience as a permissible area of inquiry and pursuit by colleges and universities, I think the Chief Justice would call that, in fact, he did in oral argument, a race neutral strategy. So there is some underlying texture and context here around what the court said. I think it is also important to recognize that this court majority did not do what Students for Fair Admission actually asked, that it expressly overrule 45 years of historical precedent. Now, while I believe it fundamentally eviscerated that precedent in application tied to these facts, there is still a theoretical framework around which we continue to strategize and consider innovation, another point Lisa made, around the ways that we might advance access, equity, and diversity goals. And so with that, I would simply say that the bottom line of the court's opinion, eviscerating the kind of compelling interests that we thought we could assert to support race status conscious practices, are gone. The door remains open to what we might do moving forward, but for the immediate term, I think the fundamental focus is likely to be on the embrace of the court's recognition that nothing in the opinion should prohibit institutions from considering the authentic, the real lived experience and perspective of applicants that may be associated with their racial identity and experience tied to the qualities they seek to advance through mission-oriented policies and practices.
Art, thank you so much for that overview, especially for really highlighting what is still possible, right? We are not asking students to hide their selves, who they are, how their culture, race, experience has informed their lives when they're applying to college, and that certainly is a victory. I'm thrilled to get to the core of what is possible and what can be done. And so I'm going to introduce one of our first expert speakers and leader of one of the first briefs that we've released in terms of providing guidance on more equitable college admissions practices. For those of you that want to learn more about the Supreme Court decision, what it does, I really do invite you to listen to our first webinar that was placed in the link. I think my team will drop it in the link again. You'll hear more from Art Coleman and from Thomas Saenz about the decision and its implications. But again, first, I'm excited to welcome Mamie Voigt. She is the president and CEO of the Institute for Higher Education Policy. And her team authored really an excellent brief that is titled Ensuring Fairness in College Admissions, Rethinking Recruitment, Demonstrated Interest Strategies, Early Decision, and Legacy Admissions. Maybe I'm thrilled that you're here nationally. You're recognized as a voice for equity and inclusion for students, regardless of income and race. And you've launched the Post-Secondary Data Collaborative. You're a tireless advocate on the federal and state front. And I'm just honored that we were able to partner on this important brief that you've put out, built on decades of research that your team has done.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to you and the campaign for leading the charge through this paper series and hosting this series of conversations on such a critically important and timely topic. At IHEP, or the Institute for Higher Education Policy, we work to build a more equitable and just society through higher education. And so this court decision and the work around promoting equitable college admissions is really at the core of much of what we do to build that more equitable and just society, because equitable admissions are a critical component to building equitable outcomes for students within higher education. And before I get into some of the details of the policies within the brief that we discussed, I also want to emphasize that there is no one single change that will make our admission system more equitable, but rather we need a set of systemic reforms that rethink our enrollment and admissions and recruitment systems in order to build the more equitable system that we desire. And so that will be a series of data-informed and student-centered and equity-focused decisions that institutions make around recruitment and admissions and enrollment practices. And today I want to talk with you about 4 aspects of college admissions that we discuss in the brief as part of this series. That's recruitment practices, demonstrated interest policies, early admissions, and legacy preferences. And in the brief, we discuss the impact of these policies and practices on Black, Latinx, Indigenous students, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian students, as well as students from low-income backgrounds. And to start off with recruitment, which is really the first phase of the process, where an institution introduces itself to a student and their family, and then begins pursuing students to encourage them to apply. Every type of recruitment strategy is targeting a specific group of students in some way, shape, or form. An admissions office is deciding which high school to visit or which community college fair to attend. And the research shows that these types of strategies can have a really notable impact on decision-making for first-generation college students. But the research also shows that when institutions are making these decisions about which high schools to visit, many of them prioritize high schools and communities that are predominantly white and affluent, rather than focusing on high schools or communities with high concentrations of students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, first-generation college goers, rural students, community college transfer students, or adults looking to return to higher education. So there's much left that can be done on the recruitment front. Aside from what was decided by the Supreme Court, many of these changes within recruitment can be made now. Recruitment practices also are deeply entwined with a second admissions practice, and that's demonstrated interest policies. And these policies consider in admissions decisions whether a student took certain steps to show that they're interested in attending that college. These could be on-campus activities like going on a campus visit or meeting with a professor or an admissions officer. They could be off-campus activities like clicking on a link in an email that they received from the institution. Now, students who are actively recruited by an institution, they have more opportunities to demonstrate their interest in the institution. And so these two practices can really pile upon each other. And these demonstrated interest policies are problematic because many of these ways to demonstrate interest are costly in terms of both time and money. So they inherently privilege students who can afford to do things like visit a college campus. Even the virtual engagements are not equally accessible to all students because we know that inequities exist in terms of access to reliable broadband and internet-enabled devices. And even more so for students to proactively take advantage of the benefits that demonstrated interest can provide in their chances of admission, they have to know that they exist. They have to know that institutions consider these type of activities as a weight on the scale in their favor. And white, high-income students, non-first generation college goers, they are more likely to have access to the counselors and networks who are sort of in the know about these policies and can tell students how important it is to click on that email or to send an email to the admissions office. The third policy we discuss in the brief is around early admissions. This is early action and early decision policies, which provide admission advantages to students who have the resources in terms of both financial ability and access to information to apply early. Now, early decision requires commitment to attend an institution if a student is admitted. And that's not a commitment that many students from low-income backgrounds can make because it eliminates the ability to compare financial aid packages across institutions. And indeed, the research shows that higher income students apply early at higher rates than students from low-income backgrounds. Early action policies do not require this same commitment to attend if admitted. But these policies still tend to benefit wealthier students who are taught about the benefits of applying early action and who have the support and resources to put together a competitive admissions package early in the process. Research even suggests that some institutions have lower admission standards for their early admissions pool, so that early decision and early action at a selective institution is equivalent to 100 points on the SAT. So this means that those early applicants who tend to be higher income, they're being assessed more leniently than students who apply at a regular deadline. And then finally, the last issue that we address in this brief is around legacy preference. Legacy policies give preference to family members of alumni, which perpetuates the racial and socioeconomic inequities from generations past. One study found that legacy applicants were 45 percentage points more likely to be admitted than equally qualified non-legacy candidates. So again, these policies around legacy preferences, they tend to benefit high-income students, white students, rather than opening opportunities to first-generation college goers, students of color, or students from low-income backgrounds. And so right now, as we're having this discussion, we're really at a moment of disruption within the higher education space, and particularly within the admissions space. COVID sparked rapid shifts in everything within higher education, and particularly within the admissions space in terms of many institutions changing their testing policies. And now that we have this Supreme Court decision, which is changing the face of the way in which race-based admissions can or cannot happen, we have another moment of disruption. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to use this disruptive moment to catalyze real practical change that can enhance equity and opportunity for more students. Michelle, thank you again for having us here as part of these discussions, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation today.
Thank you, Mamie, and thank you to your team for really highlighting the many ways that our college practices can be highly inequitable, and really the urgency and opportunity, right, in response to this decision to make sure that we review all of our practices. And so that's what I would invite all of you who are joining us that are institutional leaders to really do. I'm really glad also to be joined by Dr. Michael Bastedo. He is the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Studies and professor at the Marsal Family School of Education at the University of Chicago. He has authored one of our briefs that we are incredibly proud of, focusing on comprehensive review of applicants. And Michael is a decorated and published higher education researcher. He's really shared his expertise nationally and globally as a policy fellow for IHEP and a Fulbright scholar in the Netherlands. So Michael is going to share with us today what are some more equitable strategies for evaluating applications. And here, this is really informed by California's own experience with a ban on affirmative action enacted in 1996. The University of California, many years later, instituted comprehensive review, and Michael's going to talk to us about how colleges and universities could really look more holistically at our students. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate it. It's really great to be here with you today. And we've had really good conversation already. So I'm glad to join in. So let me, I join in so much of what has already been said. And I think I'm just gonna like hone in on these issues around holistic review and what holistic review means. And a lot of these things are elaborated in the brief that the campaign just released. So I encourage people, if you're interested to learn more, to download the brief and look at it more in detail. So holistic review in an ideal scenario is the ability is for an admissions officer to look at the credentials and achievements in the context of the opportunities that are available to that applicant in their families and high schools and neighborhoods. So it's not just like looking at them as a whole person or just reading, the entire file from beginning to end. It really is putting things in context so that you can get a sense of what is really possible for someone to achieve and to be able to create a more apples to apples comparison across applicants who come from a really wide variety of backgrounds in the admissions process. And if you don't account for those backgrounds, you're never going to get to any kind of equitable system because we have such a highly segregated and stratified high school and educational system that we have to be able to account for those things in order to be at least even remotely successful in being more equitable in our practices. We have some emerging evidence that holistic review is effective. So one of the best papers on this is actually about the California system. Zach Bleemer has put this out. It's not published yet, but he looks at the UC system's adoption of holistic review after Prop 209, and he's able to isolate holistic review being adopted, which is unusual. It mostly across the country has been adopted sort of piecemeal, and you can't do that. But in the UC case, he's able to find a pretty significant increase in the probability of students of color in particular and minoritized students to be admitted after holistic review. I also have a couple of papers that I'm going to put out soon, which look at contextualized measures. Basically, if we look at the credentials of students and if we put them in the context of the opportunities that they've had in their high schools and neighborhoods, is that a good predictor of student success? And what our papers are showing is that they are. That we can contextualize people's achievements and use that as a way to also know that they are going to be successful in our colleges, that the narrative that if we admit students who come from under-resourced neighborhoods, that they're just not going to succeed in sort of a competitive environment of a selective college just isn't borne out by the data. In terms of having better data about contexts, landscape is a really good option. This is something that comes out of research that I have done. And so obviously I'm a little biased in its favor and I'm enthusiastic about it. But we have good data from the adoption of landscape to suggest that schools are more likely to admit students who come from lower income backgrounds, who come from underrepresented neighborhoods in higher education. And so hopefully we're going to continue to work on the implementation of tools like landscape and other things that allow us to do holistic review in a way that has a lot of fidelity to our mission and to what admissions offices should want to achieve in terms of being more equitable in their practices. And again, in the brief, there's some citations there, and you can learn more about what that data looks like, and look more at what are the sort of things that something like landscape offers to admissions officers in terms of the data on high schools and neighborhoods that they can look at that can really improve their practice. There's other parts of the process as well. So I think Julie Park's going to be talking about testing next, but she also has a fabulous paper on extracurricular activities that was released, I believe, last month. And I highly encourage people to read it because, all of the things that we're talking about academic credentials play out in lots of different parts of the admissions process. And we have to review things like extracurricular activities holistically in addition to other parts of the academic portfolio. And the new paper that the Chetty group came out and that hit the paper yesterday is another example of some of the evidence of this, about the non-academic factors that are a part of the admissions process and that how they can really increase the probability that students from the top 1% are admitted to our most selective colleges. I really want to just reinforce quickly that the discussion around legacies and early admissions and testing and athletes, these all need to be part of the conversation. All of them can really change the probabilities that a student is admitted and are really connected to racial inequity and class inequity as well. And just as a final note, this isn't in my brief, but I also just want to amplify what Art said. And one of my biggest fears about this decision is admissions officers and college leaders over-interpreting this decision, and there just being this sort of logic out there that we've moved, that we can't think about race anymore in admissions. And I don't think that that is the implication of this decision. We and colleges get to decide how we're going to implement this decision and be consistent with the law. And I think we need to use that agency to meet our mission to be more racially equitable. Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. And we've dropped the link to your paper, which really provides guidance and an overview of how the University of California does comprehensive review. And so I definitely urge everyone to take a look at it. I'm thrilled to introduce our third expert and author of our brief, Julie Park. This brief is called Advancing Equity by Rethinking the Use of Test in College Admissions. Dr. Julie Park is the Associate Professor of Education at the University of Maryland, College Park College of Education. Julie, thank you for joining us today.
Sure, it's my pleasure to be here, Michelle, and thank you very much to the campaign for bringing together this great group of people and also just spurring these really important conversations, even though I know in the midst of difficult times. I'm here today to speak a little bit about the brief that I wrote on test optional and test free admissions. And so for institutions that are weighing next steps in terms of what can we do, I hope that the brief provides a lot of helpful context. I know a lot of institutions institutions feel that they just went through a major change with the move to test optional. Of course, there were schools that were test optional prior to the pandemic, several hundred. And we have some early, while there was mixed research in the beginning years in terms of the impact of test optional, we know that the most comprehensive study to date on test optional has shown a modest effect on racial ethnic diversification. But for so long, I think, within the higher ed community, among those of us seeking to advance equity, test optional was really like the idea that everyone could go test optional seemed like a dream. But then the pandemic happened, right? And one by one, all of these schools that said that they could never, that they would hold on to tests until their last dying day said, hey, we can make them optional. We realize it's not a great idea to make students take the test. At the height of the pandemic. And so, first, one by one, and then hundreds and hundreds of institutions went test optional. And so currently over 1,800 institutions are either test optional or test free, and Fair Test keeps good track of this. So within that group of test optional or sort of schools that do not require tests are 86 institutions that are currently test free. And I'll talk some more about them in a little bit. So with the widespread adoption of test optional during the pandemic, it's been a couple, we're headed into our fourth admission cycle. And so far it has been, institutions have said, hey, we like this for the most part. We have seen very, very, very few, like you can count them on 1 to 2 hands in terms of the number of schools that have decided to go back to test required. And with that, there are these institutions, even though test optional has some shortcomings, I think it may be an important stepping stone in higher ed history in terms of institutions learning on a mass scale that, yes, you can evaluate applications without test scores. You can admit incredibly talented students. And we know that many, many students are actually taking advantage of the option to not submit test scores. So Common App has data that over 50% of students applying through their platform, which is the country's largest and most comprehensive platform, are choosing to not submit a test score. And it's a slightly higher percentage, about 60% of Black and Latinx students, but it's not only confined to those populations, but really across populations. Many students are choosing not to submit scores. Now, while test optional may have some benefits, it comes with some, I think, unintended complications, and those could include confusion over whether or not to submit test scores, which may affect, low-income, first-generation, racially minoritized students who typically have less access to high-quality college counseling. It may affect them especially, and then also the fact that testing range percentiles, so that is, what is that? Either the average test score or the test score for the students in the 25th to 75th percentile of scores, those ranges are going to go up because you're going to see only higher students with higher scores submitting tests. And we worry about that because will that make students feel like, oh, wow, like that school has really high test scores. And even if I have the option not to submit my test scores, do I even want to try to apply? Do I have a chance? And so that's some concern. Test-free admissions, a big advantage of test-free admissions is that it eliminates that inconsistency, right? There no longer are testing percentile ranges because there are no longer test scores considered at the point of admission. And so really the biggest, system among selective institutions to adopt test-free admissions has been the UC system. But additionally, we see some STEM-focused institutions. Caltech has been piloting test-free and some others, and then as well as some small liberal arts colleges that were initially among the pioneers of test optional, and now they are among the pioneers of test-free. Our research group, the College Admissions Futures Collaborative, has produced a brief that is cited in the brief that I wrote for the campaign. Research on test-free is very much in early stages, but we did have the opportunity to analyze survey responses from a subgroup of admissions professionals who worked at schools that had gone test-free. And by and large, they were quite enthusiastic about how the policy was going at their institutions. They felt that it made it easier for them to identify talented students from diverse backgrounds. They talked about how they could no longer rely on the test score as a shortcut, that it forced readers to read more carefully because you're really reading all parts of the application and not just doing this mental shortcut in terms of a test score. They also talked about not feeling the pressure to have to maintain, say, the US, a high test score average for the US News and World Report ranking. So those external pressures. And other individual institutional representatives have talked about how being test-free has been beneficial in streamlining training, right? You only have sort of one set of training that you're putting people through, but then also the signaling effect. What does it say to students and their families writ large to say, we don't want your test scores. It's not just that we don't require them, we don't want them. And what sort of statement about an institution's values might that be communicating that might be especially attractive to populations that have been historically excluded from higher education and that have really suffered under the test score, the prioritization of test scores for many, many decades in higher education. So like test optional, test free is not a fix-all, but it's something that we encourage institutions to strongly consider. You know, some of them are like, hey, we're just getting comfortable with test optional, but you know, these are drastic times, which I think really require institutions to look at all options available, and certainly test-free admissions definitely is a viable option for institutions to consider, especially as they think about how they want their policies to reflect their values and to be able to attract and broaden access as much as possible.
Julie, thank you so much for your amazing research, your authorship on this report, your partnership in this effort. I think together, the three of you, Mamie, Michael, Julie, really provide some very tangible opportunities. So I'm going to invite Mamie and Michael to also turn their cameras on because we're going to shift to a few quick questions. Going to remind those of you in the audience that if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. But first, to kick off, Mamie, I wanted to start with you because you talked about recruitment and how inequitable recruitment practices can be. So what would you advise colleges do more of or less of?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Michelle. And I think, you know, with regards to the research in our brief, some of the do less ofs are fairly self-explanatory. Get rid of legacy admissions, get rid of using demonstrated interest policies and early admissions, especially early decision policies. The more nuanced aspects are around recruitment, like you mentioned, and ways in which to recruit in ways that build the types of diverse classes that we seek. And so we recommend that institutions really redirect their recruitment efforts and, for one, recruit in communities with large concentrations of Latinx, Black, Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, American Indian, Alaska Native students, and students from low-income backgrounds. Institutions have a choice about where they recruit, where they send their admissions representatives, which high schools, which college fairs they go to, and that those choices are wide open to the institutions. And so they should be selecting in ways that prioritize putting the institution in front of more students who have historically been left out of higher education. Institutions also should offer alternative recruitment opportunities for students who may not have the ability to travel to a campus on their own. So for students in rural areas or students from low-income backgrounds who don't have those resources to travel to campus on their own, these could be things like virtual visits, which as Julie was talking about the changes that the pandemic brought about, many institutions began experimenting with virtual visits and learned a lot through those experiences. There are also fly-in programs where an institution can provide that financial support to students to come visit the campus. And then we also recommend that institutions spend more time and effort focused on recruiting students from community colleges, students who have already been admitted to a community college and proven their skills and their aptitudes there, and provide those students with the opportunity to transfer to a four-year institution and to succeed there as well. So there's sort of a wealth of opportunities for institutions to be really creative here in how they go about designing their recruitment policies and practices.
Thank you, Mamie. When I was taking my own daughter on college tours, she thought it was really amazing and loved it. And she's like, oh, this is great. Did you do this when you were thinking about going to college? And it dawned on me that I hadn't set foot on any of the college campuses that I applied to. I didn't know this was a thing when I was applying to college. And I showed up at Pitzer the day I moved into Pitzer, and it was only 30 minutes away. So for low-income kids, first generation, like all of what you are sharing is so true. I do have a follow-up question for you, Mamie, because I've heard this a lot. You know, some of the reasons that colleges use these practices like early decision or demonstrated interest is really to predict enrollment, especially if they don't have a huge endowment. So how do you make the case for pivoting away from some of these practices? And are there any good examples that you have to share of colleges that have done it successfully?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an important question because institutions do face really legitimate challenges right now, both in terms of predicting yield, in hitting enrollment targets, and for public institutions, especially managing revenue as they are losing state support over the last several decades. And so these are real challenges that colleges are working through and wrestling with. And these are high stakes decisions for the institutions and for the students themselves. Ultimately, the decisions about what policies and practices to incorporate into admissions come down to values. And I think Julie spoke about this really effectively. And in what an institution decides to do and how it crafts its class is a signal of what they value and what they said is important. And if equity is a top priority, then it's incumbent upon those institutions to find creative ways to eliminate these policies that have very inequitable outcomes and still meet the needs of predicting yield. So for example, institutions could stop using demonstrated interest in their admissions decisions in deciding who to admit, while still running the calculations to use demonstrated interest to predict the size of their incoming class, and then make adjustments based on those calculations without actually using it as a thumb on the scale for any particular student. We've also heard of institutions who have examined their early action applicant pools and realized, this is from a big public flagship institution, realized that they had been shifting more and more seats into the early action acceptance pool. About 80% of their class was being filled through early action. And then they compared the demographics of their early action applicants to their applicants at the regular decision point and found vast racial disparities in those two groups. And so they made that decision to say, we're going to cut our early applicant seats by 20% to open up more seats for the regular decision applicants, which then has the impact of increasing racial equity. So institutions, they've faced enormous challenges over our history as a country, and they've always risen to meet the moment. And I think this is another moment for them to rise to meet, to use their ingenuity, use their creativity to meet these dual goals of certainly having to fill their class and predict their enrollments, while also really, really prioritizing equity at the top of that priority list.
I love that. Thank you, Mamie. Michael, I'm going to turn to you now because you've made a strong case for the importance of holistic, comprehensive review. We also know that, it's a practice that requires thought, right? Resources to put in place. So what advice do you have for college leaders? How can they do it well?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're trying to pursue something as important as racial equity, then you have to have leadership from the top down, and nothing will ever really happen if it depends upon just like the goodwill or about, if it depends on people who lead admissions and enrollment management working against their interests and working against the metrics by which they're measured, then it's just not going to work. Like the people who lead institutions have to send the message very clearly to the leaders who work for them to say, this is our priority. I need you to model for me what the consequences are going to be when we make these decisions. This is what I want to think about. This is what I want us to be, the data I want us to look at in order to figure out what's going to happen there. And once you get into serious conversations about these things, I think a lot of the things that really worry people who lead institutions really kind of fall apart. I mean, if you're talking about legacies, for example, there's no evidence that legacies lead to greater development. Like there's no evidence that legacies are better students. Actually, there's evidence that legacies are actually less good students than students who are not legacies when you control for all of the other things. So, a serious conversation looking at, what do we really know in these spaces? And over the past 10 years, the amount of research has grown so enormously in all of these different domains. There was a time at which we couldn't really say that we knew very much about a lot of things. There's very few things. We're getting down to a much smaller group of things that we would say that about. We have good data on a lot of these practices and what the outcomes are, and whether or not there would be negative outcomes if we were to change them. And so I think leaders need to really take these seriously, look at the moment that we're in, and use it as an opportunity to examine some of these practices and send the message that they're willing to change them, and they are not going to punish the people who work for them if metrics change in a direction that some people may not like, right? They have to be willing to protect the people who work inside the institution as well for difficult decisions that they make, in this regard as well.
I love that. And your brief really highlights the different criteria that can really elevate the values, right, that institutions have around true inclusion and engagement of a diverse student body. And so definitely invite everyone to look at that particular brief. It outlines, the University of California's process. My next question is for you, Art. I wanted to ask you, how you think the Supreme Court decision prohibiting race-conscious admissions at the same time works with holistic approach to admissions. You kind of alluded to this, in your opening remarks, but giving advice, to admission officers, how can they consider a student's whole experience in a way that's still permissible under the law? You're muted, Art.
Sorry. It's a great question, and I'll just begin because I can't help myself, because your question calls out what I think is fundamentally the intellectual incoherence of the majority's opinion. They're constructing holistic review as somehow considering racial status in a kind of mechanical, rigid way, when in fact anyone, as Michael can well tell you, who's done holistic review well, knows it's a very nuanced, contextual look at the individual applicant. That's why it's called individualized holistic review. And there are multiple life experiences in context in which their racial lived experience plays a role in sort of shaping that picture. So there's just a big connect rhetorically between what the court said as a matter of legal analysis and the reality, which is why I think they had to come back and say, at the end of the opinion in the final two paragraphs, oh, by the way, everything we just said, ignore it when you're talking about an applicant's racial experience, which the court considers to be, or the Chief Justice at least considers to be, legally race neutral. I think the practical guidance here for institutions is to focus on mission-aligned qualities that matter to you, first and foremost, whether it's essay questions, whether it's interview questions, whether it's some other element that may factor into your admission judgment coming through from a teacher's recommendation or a counselor's. It's really important to stay grounded in the qualities that matter to you, aligned with mission. And in that context, recognize that individual students will have different racial identities and experiences and perspectives that you can value. And so this is actually the big takeaway for me from the opinion, that as we think about good holistic review, which Michael elaborates on extensively, those practices have to reflect the reality that every student brings their own unique identity. And if the 14th Amendment has meant anything for the last 40 years, it has meant that we value the dignity of the individual, and you cannot get to the full dignity of the individual if that individual is not allowed to tell their full, authentic story. And I think that's ultimately why the Supreme Court recognized, as it had to, that it couldn't leave the decision with only just the get rid of the mechanical use of race in admissions. It had to turn to the recognition that in fact there's an element here much more substantial than that.
It makes me want to ask you about Sarah Lawrence's question. Any reactions or thoughts about the question that they've put before their next applicant class around the Supreme Court decision?
So like, I think there is a lot of strength in being able to quote the Supreme Court's words back to them, as long as that interest, and I don't represent Sarah Lawrence, so I don't have any firsthand knowledge here. I think, again, anyone who's framing the questions around which you are designing applications or interview questions, you want to ensure an authenticity around what you are trying to achieve. And candidly, there was a little bit of private cheering going on when I read the question.
So maybe somebody on my team can drop the question that Sarah Lawrence is giving as an option to students for context. Julie, I want to ask you if there's any best practices around going from using the test in college admissions to going test optional or dropping the test. You know, you talked about how the test can, you know, really be a shortcut. Sometimes I refer to it as a lazy approach to how we do review of applicants, right? That's the opposite of holistic review and what we've been talking about today. But any best practices that you'd be open to sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I am not on the ground as a reading applications at the undergraduate level, although I do read graduate school applications, and we have shifted from being GRE optional to we actually don't look at GRE scores at all. But I would say, you know, during each step, whether you're going from optional or to free, I think it just really speaks to the need to really strengthen the holistic review process, right? To really help educate the people that are reading about how so many of the contextual factors are influenced by structural inequality. And so even in the absence of test scores, things like curriculum, right? Extracurricular activities, essay content, letters of recommendation, how all of these things can be influenced by whether it's household income, race, ethnicity, parental education, first generation status, but also school context. That's something we're learning in some of our research on letters of recommendation, how private school context very much can influence. They can really know how to make students shine, right? In terms of the difference that you can have when you have a counselor who only has to write for 30 students versus one who is writing letters for 300, sometimes like 3,000 students, right? And so it's just, as Mike said, I like this language. You really want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. And oftentimes, if you're just reading at face value, you aren't comparing apples to apples. And so I think regardless of testing policy, whether you're reading with test scores or without test scores, I think the other thing I would, recommend is not to assume that just because you're reading with test scores, that means that's a fair review somehow, right? So for institutions that are either still requiring test scores or those that are test optional, but are evaluating applicants with test scores, right? To recognize the context that those test scores are coming from and not to give unfair advantage, right, to those students, to see test scores as one piece of data among many that need to be looked at in context in terms of the educational opportunity that a student may have had.
Yeah, and both your paper and Michael talks a lot about the importance of context, right? How we're evaluating students. Maybe you refer to that as well. Before I turn it over to Audrey for Q&A, because we're getting some great questions from participants, I did want to ask Art and Mamie to respond to this next one. You know, a lot of university presidents right now are trying to make sense of the ruling, but what is the one thing they can do now to let students know that they remain committed to equity? Art.
I think the most important thing is actually to pay attention to your communities, in particular your communities of color, your students, your faculty, your staff, your alumni, and to reassert the values that are embedded in your mission around your diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, and to elevate them as values that you remain committed to. This ties back to the point that the Supreme Court did not upset the ability of institutions to declare their mission. And so whatever new limitations that we have with a Supreme Court ruling on certain admissions practices, that should not be understood as anything that undermines a commitment and a recognition that students who are here belong. And I think thinking through not only the rhetoric of, public statements and speeches and maybe even committee reports, but thinking through ways to engage with students and faculty on these contentious issues in the coming months as students return to school is a really important foundation to really hone in on the point that fundamentally you belong.
Thank you, Art. Mamie?
Yeah, so it may not be a surprise that Art and I have worked together for a long time, because my answer is somewhat similar. Presidents, institutional leaders right now need to communicate that every student on their campus belongs there, should be there, can succeed there, and that they are, as an institution, as a leader, committed to each student's success within that institution. I think carrying that message that of belongingness is going to be critically important now more than ever, because some students, many folks out there may read this decision as saying that some students don't belong on college campuses. And that's absolutely not what it says. As Art has explained, the decision says that an institution can state its own values, and that so it very much should be communicating to students, you belong here, you can succeed here, and we are committed to your success here. And we are going to do everything we can to prioritize equity and diversity and inclusion within the bounds of the law.
Thank you, Mamie. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We have a number of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to kick off with our first one. And I'm going to toss this one to Dr. Julie Park. And it's a question regarding other standardized tests for professional schools, as well as for graduate schools. And, to what extent is our tests like the LSAT, the MCAT, the GRE posing barriers for underrepresented, marginalized groups? And is there a movement right now to walk away from those?
Sure. Graduate school exams are not my particular area of expertise, but I do know a little bit. So I'll share what I know. I think very much within all of those professional circles, there are similarly efforts to either call for test-free versions of test-free or test optional admissions, and certainly de-emphasizing the role of test scores in reviews. I know that in profiles I've seen of UC Davis Medical School, which has been held up as somewhat of an exemplar of being able to, really enroll a racially and ethnically and economically diverse class of students. In those efforts, they have stated that de-emphasizing test score, the MCAT, was a big part of being able to expand and diversify access. And so certainly within graduate admissions, I think that similar types of movements are important. They are also not a fix-all, and I see that even in our own grad school admissions process, where we don't use the GRE. Really, we haven't used it in quite some time, but then at the same time, we have the students who apply, right? And we work with that pool, but there are different barriers that influence whether certain students are going to apply in the first place. So it's very much an all hands on deck, from recruitment to point of application to nurturing those relationships. On the other hand, certainly there have been cases where students, I know in particular, even from our own field of, graduate education in the field of education, where you had programs that used to really emphasize test scores heavily, and they and they talk about how they're able to admit certain very talented students that they would not have otherwise been able to admit previously. And so very much, I think that there's going to be continued dialogue on the role of tests, especially in subfields where reliance on test scores has been even more entrenched than it is in others.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park. We have a couple of questions coming in from high school counselors who are clearly trying to respond to the decision and figure it out, while, probably in a short month, we'll need to be guiding students through a very real admissions process. And so there are a couple of questions I'm hoping Art, maybe Mamie and Michael can tackle. First is, if you were on an elevator ride with a high school-based counselor who's struggling with how to guide rising seniors, what would you say to them? And tagging on to that, are there things that counselors can think about in terms of how they write letters of recommendations, how they might edit their own school profiles to best position their students to be competitive applicants? So Mamie, Michael, Art, whoever unmutes first gets to go.
I'll kick off only because I love that question. I teach a course on enrollment management and the law for master's students, and my litmus test question is, if you were on an elevator in the Empire State Building, how would you? And this is of that ilk. I think the fundamental message coming out of the Supreme Court's opinion is, have your students tell their authentic lived story. What is it that makes you special, unique? What is it that illustrates your particular interest in an institution? What is it that you're going to bring to the table? I think, in essence, my general guidance to the field is the job of figuring out how you navigate the court's ruling is the job of the higher education admissions and professionals with their lawyers by their side. This is not the job for counselors to over pivot on in any form or fashion. Have your students tell their story and let the college officials worry about sort of navigating the legal parameters of that.
Thank you. Michael or Mamie?
100%. The decision said that students should talk about challenges vested, and so they absolutely should do that. That was part of students telling their story before this decision, and it should continue to be part of students telling their story now. And the same goes for counselors or teachers who are writing letters of recommendation, being really clear about the circumstances that the student has been living in and the ways in which they've thrived and overcome challenges and navigated complexities, and make that case for a student based on the circumstances within which they're operating.
100%.
Great. I want to pivot back to maybe Art for a second for a more legal question. And the question is really about whether or not practices of recruitment, and I think maybe you talked a little bit about this, but there has been a big effort to have really aggressive recruitment in underrepresented communities to get those students to apply, to understand the admissions process, maybe even provide fee waivers to low-income students. Is there anything in the court ruling that jeopardizes those practices?
So it's a great question, and I'll just kick off to say, one of the rare times a lawyer can be definitive and categorical. Absolutely nothing in the court's opinion that touches the existing court precedent on recruitment and outreach. And that's a really big deal in the context of a body of federal case law over decades that has actually recognized the ability of institutions to bring race intentionality to the design of programs and practices associated with recruitment and outreach that don't trip and trigger into race consciousness because you're not conferring that individual benefit on a particular student based on their race. It's about, where do I target high schools? Where do I go as a matter of geographic focus? Where do I go in terms of the broad array of student demographics that I'm looking for in what courts have historically termed inclusive practices? And so the guidance that I am providing to my clients, by the way, I should have said earlier, nothing I'm saying here is legal advice to anyone on the webinar unless you happen to be a client, and then we'll talk, is for the purposes of navigating and mitigating the limitations or the harms stemming from the court's decision. We should be all in on the very issues that Mamie elevated around recruitment and outreach, because that is actually an area where the courts in particular will affirm your ability to have a racial intentionality and not consider it race conscious for legal purposes.
Yeah, could I just add to that? I think for people who want to dig into this, there's a series of papers from Karina Salazar and Ozan Jaquette that are out there that TCOS issued some briefs. They also have the original academic papers on this. They have done outstanding work on this question. And right now, our recruitment practices are, at selective colleges, the evidence we have is that they are extremely tilted towards white and wealthy applicants in a pretty extreme way. And so there is a lot of room for improvement in this space that is completely within the bounds of legality. And I hope institutions will take this opportunity to do that.
Appreciate the unequivocal clarity that both of you have provided. Pivoting back to Julie on testing again, there's a question really, or a statement on the fact that campuses that are test optional leave room for scrutiny. How they're used, how they compare, how an institution compares a student who has a test compared to another student who doesn't is maybe a mystery, maybe closed. What is your suggestion for how we do test optional well? Are there campuses that you know of that aren't doing it well and actually harming students who don't submit test scores? Want to get your insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know offhand of any institutions that have come on the radar that people are saying you're not doing it well. I mean, I don't know if down the line there will be, but in general, it's test optional. I think, it hasn't raised, it's just not we thought it would be a radical departure from requiring tests, but in some ways it didn't change things that much, I think. And so in some ways that I haven't seen any cases where people feel that students are being treated unfairly because they are submitting or they aren't submitting test scores. That said, in terms of the information that the public has to go off of, like all other areas of how admissions officers will or admissions professionals will assess applicants, it happens within the office itself. That said, I know institutions in general have been, pretty good in a number of ways in terms of having checks and balances, right? And I think they're aware that this is one area that could be scrutinized, right? And so I imagine that there are a number of internal checks, right? In terms of, I know that they talk in some of the interviews we did, they talked about procedures that they had for training readers, for calibrating readers, for helping readers to be aware of, if you're evaluating students with test scores, without test scores, these are the things that you need to keep in mind. And so I don't think it really comes down to, oh, you have this one student who has the test score and this other student who doesn't have the test score, and who are you going to let in, right? It's more like these are students and they all have different pieces of information. Some people will have an additional piece of information, which is a test score. How are you going to assess that? You should assess that and evaluate that within the context for educational opportunity. And then from there, because it's individualized holistic review, institutions will make decisions based on an individual basis in terms of, are we going to admit this student or not admit this student?
Thank you. There's some questions about holistic review, and I want to look at both Michael and Mamie for this question. Thinking about holistic review, preparing your admissions team to do holistic review, even preparing your team to think about how you approach test optional, those things cost money. And there's a question in here about the fact that, you have quote unquote non-elite institutions that may not have the budgets currently to do this type of work. They may have been using an index to do admissions or relying heavily on an index. What have you seen nationally as ways to budget for this, as ways to prioritize this, and what we know is probably going to be some shrinking budget years in the coming years?
Sure, I could get started. So even when we surveyed about 7 or 8 years ago, 95% of selective colleges said they did holistic review. So of the selective colleges, most of them were doing some form of holistic review, but there is no doubt that it is an expensive process. And as applications have grown across the country to these colleges, there's been a massive expansion in the number of people who read admissions files. And a lot of people read admissions files seasonally, not as full-time admissions officers. They bring in like a team of people who read just for the season. And so the key there is being able to train all of them and to train them to do it well. And I think there's been an increasing awareness that is a really important thing to do. And that even people who are longtime and experienced admissions officers really need to go through an annual retraining around, what the principles and practices are and doing it well. but there's no solution to no money. And it's certainly my talking head can't fix that problem. I think if the institution is committed, it needs to find the money to be able to do a holistic process and to be able to do it well. But even at schools that have money, they are reading files very, very fast. We are talking about file reads that are in the range of 6 to 12 minutes. Like, even at colleges that you would consider to be very well off, well-resourced schools. So there are ways to try to do that process in a pretty efficient way, and particularly in terms of like structuring data. This might be kind of boring for this webinar, but like there's ways in which data can be provided to admissions officers in more or less efficient ways, right? So if you're going into a system and then clicking on a PDF and sitting there and waiting 3 minutes for a PDF to load, that is 3 minutes of time and money that you have just spent waiting for that PDF to load, right? So there are ways in which the technology can help make the process a little bit more efficient, and those things can also be used to try to make things more equitable by displaying data in particular ways, so that admissions officers are anchored on the things that are contextual and not just on the things that are about like one student's individual achievements.
Thank you, Mamie.
Yeah, I would add to that. In some of these instances, the changes that we're talking about are no cost or low cost. So things like getting rid of legacy admissions preferences, that shouldn't cost anything. That's just a change that could happen quickly. Things like, so some of them are no cost, some of them could reallocate funding from one aspect to another. So Michael raised the research that has been done around recruitment practices and how some institutions are recruiting at private institutions, at institutions out of state, spending a lot of resources on areas that are predominantly white and predominantly high income. Those institutions could simply reallocate where they're sending their admissions officers to different areas of the country in order to make these types of recruitment changes. And I think this point around education and training is incredibly important as well, to help people understand how to read applicant files, how to make these assessments. And that's especially important if institutions do not eliminate some of these inequitable practices. So if an institution is going to keep using demonstrated interest as a way of giving preference to candidates or keep early decision policies, they need to also educate and train their folks who are reviewing the applicant files about the inequities within that system and about the ways in which some students may be able to take greater advantage of those types of opportunities than others, so that they can be reviewed in context. So, in short, I'd say some of these things, no cost, some of them are reallocating costs, some of them require training. Some of them, if an institution is not already doing really extensive recruitment in the ways that we've been talking about here, they may require additional costs. And that's where it comes down to the decisions of leadership to really focus on this as a priority for the organization and deciding to invest their scarce dollars in something that is a key priority in terms of equity and diversity for their institution.
Thank you, Mamie. I've got one last question. We have a number of questions still in the queue. So just for everyone listening in, we're going to do our best to get those questions answered post-webinar and post them alongside this video so that you can come back to the answer. There is a question from Pamela Birdman on the exception that SCOTUS drew on the military academies. And Pam, I just want to direct you to our previous webinar where both Art Coleman and Thomas Sines with MALDEF dug into that specific question. And there's a good segment on there with, I think, some important information for you. But the last question I want to throw out there, and maybe if each of you want to just give your 30-second response, we've been talking a lot today about the impact of the SCOTUS decision on high school students. But we know across the country, here in California, the vast majority of students who are in college are in a community college. And so the question is, how is this decision impacting community college students? And on top of that, the transfer function, does it have any bearing on those students? So Julie, I don't know if you want to start. I'm looking at you.
Sure. Well, I think one potential repercussion of the ruling is, what we saw in California, which that we saw, ripple effects from the decision. While there were, some of the most blatant effects, right, at the most selective UCs, right, UCLA and Berkeley, we saw ripple effects across the system, and students who would have gone to one of those institutions or as UC eventually sort of being sorted into a different type of institution that tended to have less resources. And then also we saw more students being, who starting at the community college or probably having to start their journey in the community college instead of starting at a four-year institution. And so the concern, so on one hand, of course, community colleges are amazing. Of course, institutions across the board have played such a critical role in expanding opportunity, but we also know that historically these institutions have been under-resourced or have not been given the resources that they need to be able to support students. And that we know that too many students, in community college, while it can be a gateway for opportunity, some students unfortunately have a hard time transferring, have a hard time figuring out credit requirements or navigating the system. And so one concern I think for the ruling is that, if we do see whether it's students who feel like, okay, I maybe could have gone to this institution, but I don't know if I would feel welcome there, or for whatever reason they may apply or not apply, right? And if they are beginning their journey at the community college, we want to make sure that they have the support that they need to be able to transfer, right, and to be able to complete their degree. But we know in its current state, right, too many students fall through the cracks in the system. So I think the ruling, right, is a reminder that even though, you see these obvious effects at, say, so-called elite institutions, that really, all of higher education is connected as a system, right, and that we have a responsibility to make sure that the resources are going really to the students who need them the most.
I'm happy to jump in here next. I think that there's a key role here for community colleges, particularly in terms of the transfer pathways. As institutions, particularly selective institutions, are thinking about ways to diversify their classes, community college transfer students are a talented, vast pool of students who could succeed at a selective institution. Right now, 50% of community college students are students of color, and 45% come from families making less than $25,000 a year. So they're students from low-income backgrounds and students of color. And yet we see that some of the most selective institutions, only 8% of students at highly selective public institutions and only 5% of students at highly selective private colleges have transferred from another institution. So this is a completely untapped pool of talented students who could be attending these selective institutions, bringing diverse perspectives and experiences into the college environment. And so they should, institutions should be turning to the transfer pipelines far more than they currently are in order, especially now in light of the decision.
Thank you, Mamie and Julie. I appreciate all of your comments. Thank you again, Julie, Michael, Mamie, Art, for your candid responses. I'm going to turn it over now back to Michelle Siqueiros to close out our program.
Thank you, Audrey. And I also just want to thank all of you, Lisa, Art, Julie, Mamie, Michael. Thank you for your leadership, for showing us that we can be upset about a decision, but there is still important work to be done. And Michael, your comments earlier reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from Maya Angelou, who said, "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." And I think that's the call to action for all of us, is that we know that there are better practices for more equitable admissions in higher education. And we invite all of you who care about an inclusive, multiracial nation and democracy that we do better for all of our students. I invite you to stay in touch with us. In the coming months, the Campaign for College Opportunity will continue to release additional briefs as part of our Affirming Equity, Ensuring Inclusion, and Empowering Action series. These are the first 3 that really speak to more equitable college admissions, but we will have additional legal analysis and recommendations for equity in higher education, authored by Art Coleman himself. We will be speaking to how we can ensure more welcoming campuses and inclusive hiring. What are some strategies for equitable college preparation and strengthening K-12, as well as policies, both state and federal, that can strengthen financial aid and affordability and pathways to and through college. So I hope you'll be on the lookout for those additional briefs and join us as we continue to do the important work of ensuring that every student, regardless of where they live, the wealth that they have, and the color of their skin, have a true opportunity to go to college in our nation. Thank you again. Have a great week.